Okay, everyone. Good to go. Got thumbs up. That's wonderful. We're right on time, I think. So we'll get started. As ever, a lot to get through. So first thing I have to do is apologise because I'm not John Barrett, who can't be here because he's unwell, which is obviously a real shame for all kinds of reasons. But really, he was an absolute powerhouse in getting this project underway and completed as he did. We're going to be talking to you about, or at least I and Stephen Pye, who were involved, are going to be talking to you about the Positive Low Energy Demand Futures project undertaken within the CREDS consortium, the Centre for Research on Energy Demand Solutions, of which both Steve and myself are part. And then we have three commentators who we've asked to really not just critique the work as such, but asked to think about why some of the things which we've put forward and we believe to be very persuasive, or ought to be very persuasive in this piece of work, are not actually happening. So the sort of main impetus of the discussion is to really try and identify the knotty things, but really try and pull them apart in a constructive way. So the piece of work, as I say, was led by John in the consortium, and we believe it to be the most comprehensive assessment to date on the contribution that the demand side can contribute to carbon reductions and support our energy transition as well as our climate targets. I'm not going to say very much because Steve will give you the detail or as briefly the detail, if there's not an oxymoron, in a moment. But let's just remind ourselves what the impetus is for this. It kind of goes without saying, or at least it should go without saying, but the IPCC has showed that the majority of the emissions reductions in the UK need to happen within the next 10 years. The government has a target of 78% reduction by 2035. The IPCC report suggests that actually doesn't go far enough in order for us as a country to contribute to the international goals. But in any case, whether it's the UK's target or going even more ambitiously, as the IPCC suggests, really we've got the next 8 years. We're going to know whether we've blown it or not by around about 2030, but definitely by 2035. And it is the early, rapid reductions that are going to make a difference, given the cumulative pathway that we are leading to. So, again, just to sort of spell out the obvious, but just to make sure that we are all on the same page. Roughly speaking, we have three different options, three approaches, three ways of achieving these reductions. We can decarbonise our energy system. We can deploy nature-based solutions and engineer carbon dioxide removal, etc. And we can reduce our demand for energy. And it's the level of energy demand that determines the size of the energy system. And that's really important in our modelling. It determines energy demand, determines the size of the system, determines our reliance, or the degree to which we have got to rely on these unproven removal technologies. And so the piece of work asked how low can we take our energy demand without impacting on our quality of life? And we really did centre the quality of life piece within this piece of work because, of course, and I'm sure this will come up in discussion, some of the main resistance to this is not how to do it, it's not technology, it's not some resources, given that we know a lot of what we're talking about is actually money saving. It's about the political resistance, the public acceptance, and whether or not it leads to people having to make sacrifices and lead a lower quality of life. So that was a major part of what we looked at. So we brought together sector level energy demand models. You'll see that we looked at transport, we looked at food, we looked at industry, etc. And we integrated that modelling with whole systems energy models to look at a variety of different scenarios and produce an assessment of these demand side contributions. And of course, we know obviously, and the modelling takes into consideration that the demand changes that we're talking about have to take place, will take place alongside supply system changes. That's all part of what we're looking at, but just to be clear, on the demand side, we're looking both at energy efficiency, technology, developments, as well as energy demand services. And effectively, we were able to sort of conceptualise or distill the demand, these kind of ways in which we could reduce demand into 3 types of shift. So we could ignore. We could either ignore those demand changes. That's 0. That's not one of them. We could steer those energy demands, and we could shift those energy demands. So a spoiler alert, in case you just don't quite get the key findings from the study, but I'm sure you will from Steve as well. But just to put them very briefly to you, the analysis suggests that the key technologies like heat pumps, electric vehicles, combined with the broader social changes that we talk about, can halve UK's energy demand by 2050. That leaves a residual energy set of emissions of around 40 million tonnes to deal with in other ways. And the various scenarios suggest that halving could actually be even higher. We could go beyond that by 2050 if additional energy efficiency changes and social shifts emerged, which is plausible, that we don't know about at the moment, and therefore obviously did not take into consideration in the model. And as I say, we looked at the quality of life aspects, and we suggest, in terms of the monetary benefits and other societal benefits and individual level benefits, that we could achieve those shifts whilst improving the quality of life of citizens. So that's my synopsis. Steve is going to give you a bit more detail on that for around 10 minutes. Then we have 3 other contributors who I will introduce as we go along. So thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Jillian. So, good afternoon, everyone. An unexpected pleasure to be talking up here, and apologies again for not being John. But it's been a fantastic project to be involved in, and I really am grateful for the opportunity to talk a little bit about it. So yes, as Jillian said, this is really an analysis to show what the contribution could be from energy demand reduction in the context of our net zero targets. And really just to also say that this is very much about the opportunity space. So we're really looking at what are the interventions across the different sectors. We've done less on the implementation. Now, of course, this workshop's very much about the implementation gap, and hopefully we'll be able to pick up some of those issues in the panel discussion going forward. But this is really about working out what is the potential across those different sectors and across the different options. So I wanted to first just talk a little bit about the motivation for the study itself. As Jillian said, this is about what role energy demand reduction can play in meeting net zero alongside the supply side, right? So we're not saying energy demand reduction is this, this total solution. We still need all of that supply side tech, of course. So it's motivated by a number of issues, and this is why we really wanted to get stuck into this topic. We know energy demand reduction can deliver in the near term, and we know a lot about how to do it. And this is super important in the context of the current energy and cost of living crisis. We know that there's a lot of measures there that can alleviate some of those concerns around energy security and affordability. And we know we can deliver these in the near term, which is very different from what's in the energy security strategy, which is very much about sort of big tech and delivering that in the long term. We also know that we have a real imperative to rapidly decarbonize. We can't wait, and we need to be able to do this with some certainty. And again, I think there's a lot of the options that we're looking at that really give us some certainty we know how to do this. So I think that's the sort of other motivation. But of course, I mean, clearly a lot of this is largely absent in the sort of existing strategies that have recently been formulated. And as I say, this is reflected in the British energy security strategy, which is very much a supply side focused take on where we go from here. And not only that, there's the bioenergy session previously, which talked a lot about nets or CDR, carbon dioxide removal. And we wanted to look at this issue because we think the current sort of strategy and approach really bakes in a lot of high risk CDR. So, you know, it's upwards of 50 million tons to 100 million tons by 2050 that we're expecting to remove. And we have a UK emission at the moment of 320 million tons, maybe a bit more if we include aviation. So it's a big chunk of emissions. And if we're betting on that, that has inevitable risks. So there's this question about, you know, how do we make a strategy that's more robust? And we think that actually energy demand reduction can play a strong role in that. So what was the approach? We used an ensemble of 6 models, 5 sector models, and an integrating framework to look at the role that energy demand reduction could play. So as Jillian said, we had sector models looking at nutrition, on shelter, so domestic, mobility, and so forth. And we put a lot of effort into ensuring consistency between these models. So for example, if we were making changes in terms of dietary habits, this would then feed into the food and drink sector in terms of the industry sector. Similarly, if we weren't building certain transport infrastructure, that would have an impact on construction. So all of these different sectors, a lot of effort was put into ensuring consistency across the narratives that we were building. And we actually think this is quite an innovative approach to modelling, and we're about to publish a paper that puts some of this work in more of an international context, and we think it could be a really valuable contribution to other countries as they formulate their NDCs and their long-term low-carbon development strategies. So as Jillian alluded to, we had scenarios where we're doing very little energy demand reduction. So there's a scenario called IGNORE, which pretty much tracks how energy demand has reduced historically, which, okay, there's been some periods of decline, but since the 1970s, we're more or less at the same level in terms of overall energy consumption. So we had that sort of don't do much to a transformative scenario, which looked at transforming institutions, social practices, and infrastructure, and that was called Transform. And Jillian's made the point that, you know, we really tried in this kind of transformative scenario not to sort of compromise quality of life indicators and so forth, still providing the population with the energy services that they needed. Okay, so just to move on very quickly to some of the insights. Jillian's already said and taken the headline message that we can halve our energy use in 2050 relative to 2020 levels. And we've done a lot of work to sort of look at the breakdown of that. So that's 22% from efficiency and 29% from social change. So we use this framework, many of you probably know, called Avoid, Shift and Improve. So avoid and shift is around sort of providing energy services in a more efficient way or avoiding them altogether, whereas improve is about all of those sort of efficiency measures. So that's the sort of headline, that sort of halving of energy use, a lot of that from efficiency, but even more from sort of social change. And this happens across all sectors. So all sectors need to be involved in this, from nutrition to materials and products, shelter and mobility, covering a huge array of options too. So really sort of big option space. And some of those sectors, they do rely more on the avoid shift bit than they do on the efficiency. So nutrition's a good example, where a lot of the measures are around dietary change, calorific intake, waste reduction and so forth. The other thing, so that's the sort of headline, but we also highlight that we need stronger energy demand reduction to simply meet our net zero target. So some analysis we did where we sort of held back on energy demand reduction under a scenario called STEER, we found that actually we're not able to meet our targets even if we're deploying all of that supply side technology and all of that carbon dioxide removal options. We also suggested, and we didn't really get into this in a huge amount of detail, that we would see very substantial co-benefits from this kind of approach. So for example, in terms of health, from dietary change, how we do mobility, so an emphasis on active travel, and also the environmental benefits, so more of a focus on biodiversity, improved air quality and so forth. Just touching on another insight, so the investment required would be significantly reduced over time. So I don't know if some of you were in the cost of decarbonisation session yesterday with Mike Thompson, who was talking about an annual investment level of £50 billion per year from the sort of late 2020s onwards. In this scenario, that is significantly reduced, because essentially we've got a smaller system. We're providing less energy, and we're supplying less energy because we've reduced on the demand side. And then another sort of really interesting insight was that we would moderate. So this is within that. So we would moderate the need for big infrastructure development. So rather than building out an electricity generation system that went from 300 to 500 terawatt hours, that would go from 300 to 800 terawatt hours. You know, in our transform scenario, we're looking at a system, still a big system and a big increase on today, but it would be around 500 terawatt hours, so significantly smaller. And then the final point is that we can almost reduce the requirement for engineered removals, or, sorry, I keep using lots of different terms, but negative emission technologies or carbon dioxide removal, we can almost eliminate the use of those options. So things like bioenergy with CCS and direct air capture. And what we would say the associated risks with those sorts of technologies too. Okay, so finally, we think this is the first sort of comprehensive look at energy demand reduction, as Jillian said, mapping out the opportunity space. But I think it's going to be critical to gain traction with the policy community. We'll need to map out what those policies are that might be needed to realise some of this potential, and how this approach can contribute to actually closing the implementation gap. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Before I forget, I do just want to ask you to please post your questions in a normal way for the remainder of the Q&A session. So thanks very much, Steve, and I hope everyone is sort of able to follow along and grasp the basics. Clearly, on the Creds website, we have the main LED report, and we have a paper about to be published in Nature Energy, which was it Nature Climate Change? Nature Energy. It was Nature Energy, yeah, sorry, mind blip. Where they gave us the publication date of week beginning of the 13th, so any day now, that should also be online. Okay, let me get the rest of my notes up. Right, we've got three, as I said, three other speakers. We have seen Patrick, great. Hi Patrick. Good, that's wonderful. And as I said to you before, just wanted to make sure that we can focus, if we can, on, you know, obviously any reactions you want to give to the work, but also why you think it's not happening, and some key things that we need to think about very urgently to try and solve for that. So I'm going to ask Patrick to speak first. Patrick is a professor at the University of Exeter. He spans a whole number of social science insights across a range of environmental challenges, from geography to environmental psychology, and indeed has just won a major ESRC investment to create a leadership team of environmental social scientists. So that's called the Access team, the Advancing Capacity for Climate and Environment Social Science. And I'm happy to be a bit involved with that. So he's really got his hands full because the remit that the ESRC have given us for that is enormous. We're supposed to revolutionise the way in which social science is used across all kinds of environmental agendas. So any support you can give us on that one, please do. So Patrick, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jillian, and for mentioning the Access project as well. That's fantastic. Yeah, so I've just got a couple of slides. I won't spend too long on them, and then I'll address some of those discussion points and see if we can be a bit provocative and get a good discussion going. But in terms of the slides, I would just like to stress that in some senses what I'm going to show now is some outputs of the IPCC Working Group 3 Chapter 5 that I was involved in over the last 4 or 5 years. And I think it's interesting to do this for a couple of reasons, but mainly I think because the findings of our review work in that chapter are actually very consistent with the findings of the report that we've just been hearing about from Stephen and John Barrett's work. So there's a pleasing consistency there, and you can see that in this first slide. But before I get into the detail, I guess it's worth just stepping back a little bit and just saying a little bit about what an IPCC chapter involves. So in that sense, it's not primary data collection, it's a review piece of work based on thousands and thousands of references. And it's a global level of analysis. It's not about the UK or any particular region or any particular continent, it's at the global level. And it is interesting in the light of our discussion today and our topic to note the fact that this was the 6th assessment round of the IPCC. So in other words, it's been going for 25 to 30 years. And yet this was the first time that there was a specific standalone chapter on demand and service provision in Working Group 3 on climate mitigation. So for the last 5 assessment rounds, demand has been covered, but it's been, included in a minor way in other chapters on cities or buildings, whatever, rather than having a standalone focus and enabling social sciences to be primarily involved. So I think that maybe sets the UK context a little bit as well in terms of the challenges involved in actually gaining traction of narratives around implementation and intervention on the demand side. I'd just like to also say that there's many things in this chapter, and you can download the report from the IPCC Working Group 3 website. But we also looked in detail at things like inequalities within and between countries, things like decent living standards and sustainable development goals. So we tried to take a holistic approach to demand and service provision and social aspects of mitigation. So just to pluck out a couple of the key diagrams that are in and figures in Chapter 5, here is one, it's called Figure 5.7, and it really backs up the kind of headline finding of the UK CREDS report, which is that there is the possibility of reducing demand by approximately half in the timeframe that we need to achieve that net zero target at 2050, which is really quite astonishing. But that is the result of the IPCC global review analysis as well. And what this figure shows is that you can break down that potential, that global potential for demand reduction, end-use interventions across different sectors and across different kinds of intervention. So just to describe the 3 main colors here, the blue stands for socio-cultural, behavioral interventions, the red stands for infrastructural change, and the yellow is about specific technologies and new technologies. So one of the things that the IPCC chapter was trying to get across is that it's the combination of the deployment of these different kinds of interventions, all working in synchrony with each other, that is key to these opportunities that we've identified for reducing demand. And if you look at these figures as well, they also make clear that demand side intervention is not sufficient to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in any of these sectors. You also need supply side interventions. But having said that, and it varies across the different sectors, you can make a substantial reduction in greenhouse gas emissions across these sectors by intervening on the demand side. So what are we talking about? Well, again, we use that avoid, shift, improve categorization in order to understand different specific changes or behaviors that could be altered in relation to the sector. So in terms of avoid, we're thinking of increased use of teleworking, for example, which reduces commutes and flights, for example. It could be the redesign of cities to be more compact to promote active travel, such as walking and cycling. Shifts could be shifts in diet away from meat-based foods towards plant-based diets, or shifting travel modes. And improve would be improving the efficiency, for example, of the building stock. So there are many different kinds of interventions and ways of avoiding emissions in the first place, shifting or improving existing structures. And all of these are required, basically. And we really need policy making that works with all of them in combination. And then in some senses, makes behavior change easier by putting certain kinds of infrastructural change or technological changes in place that take some of the difficulty out of behavior change that you might get at the moment. Next slide, please. Yeah, so yeah, that's it. Yeah, I've kind of talked through some of those, so we can move on. So the next slide really is about the overall narrative, I think. A lot of the time, discussions of demand side are about what we have to do less of, what we have to give up, what we have to avoid or stop doing. And I think the analysis here, which correlates well-being outcomes with demand-side interventions, shows that in 3/4 of the cases of this analysis, you can substantially and significantly improve human well-being by also tackling the demand side at one and the same time. So there's a key opportunity here, I think, in terms of dialogue with policymakers and other actors in society, to adopt a very positive narrative about the benefits to all for living happier, healthier lives, traveling in a different way, eating in a different way, which leads to reduced negative health outcomes, various very positive outcomes that were identified in this review, and therefore allow us to create, I hope, a more positive narrative around the benefits. Very few people will argue that we benefit from having such a high proportion of individuals, for example, in our society who are obese, for example. So making better connections between climate mitigation, demand-side interventions, and those existing concerns that are there across society and across policy-making contexts could be an opportunity for us to try and increase the emphasis upon this in policy-making more generally. Next slide, please. Now, it's one thing saying we need to reduce demand and enable these interventions, but it's clearly another thing deploying them and implementing them at scale. And I think what we tried to do in the chapter is to recognize that there are multiple roles that individuals and organizations play, and that all of them need to be addressed and thought through in terms of making a successful strategy for implementation on the demand side. So we have individuals who have certain professional roles, for example, who might act as intermediaries. We have people as voters, as citizens. We have individuals as consumers, for example. We have different kinds of contexts, organizational contexts, business contexts, residential contexts. All of them offer different potentials and show that the behavioral side, in a way, also needs to be taken into account of in relation to kind of broader social and cultural trends that are going on. And if there can be a transformation towards an emphasis upon service provision rather than simply consumption, if that shift can be done, then it requires a collective effort on behalf of all groups in society and individuals adopting different roles. And also that the benefit of designing instruments and policies and infrastructural changes in light of what we know about social and cultural and behavioral change processes. So that kind of holistic and relational approach to those different interventions is really important in terms of realizing a transformative paradigm shift in this space. And again, this is a figure from the demand chapter. This is 5.14, if people want to follow it up in more detail. Next slide, please. So yes, if you could just pop down through the bullet points. So a number of points here which came out of the chapter and the evidence analysis that we did. As we've described, there is a large potential to reduce demand consequently to reduce the necessity for supply-side interventions, or CDR, by tackling the demand side with greater seriousness and effectiveness. But of course, that's easier said than done. And the research that we did looked, for example, at social movements, collective action in society, and how that sometimes opened up windows for policy change, not always, and sometimes social movements can actually work against climate mitigation in some ways, but that is one of the parts of the elements of transformation that's worth thinking about much more closely. I've mentioned already the significant role that middle actors can play in terms of planners of transport systems, building professionals, estate managers, facility managers, etc. These individuals have extremely important roles and will need targeted and tailored interventions in order to enable them to achieve transformative change. And I think Felix and others on the chapter came to certain conclusions about the necessity to kind of redesign the infrastructures of our everyday lives, and the kind of choices that we're presented with by those infrastructures in terms of making decisions about consumption and demand. And it's when you take the different strategies in combination and the different interventions in combination that you can achieve the potential for transformation through an integrated approach. So why isn't it happening already? I mean, that's a kind of $6 million question, and I've just got a couple of thoughts to share. We'll see how everybody thinks about those. One is the point that in some senses, maybe for policymakers, it's perhaps easier to tell a story of change, which is about one big thing or two or three big things, rather than lots and lots and lots of small scale actions across society, across sectors, across buildings, communities. So it may be a more difficult, a more complex message to sell, a more difficult narrative to say, because it is so distributed and requires so many different levels of intervention and actors to be involved. So there's something there about simplicity and complexity, and the relative simplicity perhaps of talking about big scale investments in nuclear or offshore wind or other kind of supply side interventions, which are relatively easy to kind of just describe and pigeonhole. I also think that we need to think about both policy and politics in terms of ideology here as well. And I think there are some issues around conservative values and certain ways of thinking around demand use interventions. For example, whether in promoting demand side intervention, you are telling people what to do, or you are kind of advocating maybe some kind of government centrally planned transformation across society, and you know, a proclivity to a position which allows people the freedom to get on with their lives, or views the state as not being primarily involved in making substantial interventions in various ways. It isn't easy necessarily to synchronize that with the kind of transformative deployment of demand-side interventions. So it'd be interesting to discuss that. So I just thought there's a couple of political things that might be worth bringing up there, as well as that issue about the complexity in delivery that we might want to discuss in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Jillian, just a technical one to reboot. Can you just give me 2 minutes?
Sure. Yeah, of course. Okay. Technical issues. That's absolutely fine. I mean, I don't know if Patrick can still hear me. Maybe not. No, he's gone, has he? Oh, all right. Okay. Oh, he can hear, can he? All right, great. Well, obviously, it remains me to say thank you very much. And I just think it really does stand out, doesn't it? Just, you know, when you look at that IPCC demand chapter and you look at the 40 to 70% figure that they have come out with to assess the potential of demand side changes, you set that against what we've done. I mean, these are absolutely enormous. And you set that against the actual effort, whether it's in the narrative, whether it's in the finance, you know, financial mechanisms, whether it's in the policy prescriptions and detailed policies that we have, the contrast couldn't be greater. But I was also sitting there thinking about how here we have this kind of, you know, great positive story and relative consensus, at least so far, and yet there is a lot of resistance to this in one way or another. So I want to make sure that some of that comes out, so please do think of those provocative questions for afterwards. Okay, so we are now, I think, back up and running by the looks of it. So I'm delighted to introduce Maria Sharmina, who we've only met online, I think, so far, as a result of some work that Maria is involved with the office, the Government Office for Science, who is embarking on its own exercise for scenario development. So I'm hoping that you'll reflect on some of that with us today. And you're at the University of Manchester School of Engineering. So over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. It's really good to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So my day job was at the Tyndall Centre at the University of Manchester, and Oliver, who was organising the session, they were trying to get a policymaker, but they got me, so that's why I'm here. So I've been on a secondment for the past 6 months with the Government Office for Science and the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And at this point, I have to add that my views are, not representative of those of the Government Office for Science or Department for BASE. So I'm speaking here in an academic capacity. So we've been working on a project called Net Zero Society Scenarios and Pathways. And next slide, please. So I'm going to cover a couple of points from the brief that we were given for this session. So I'll touch briefly on why we are not managing to use low energy demand opportunities in the way that we probably should, and how we can go about it to do it better, hopefully. So some of these things our project is trying to address. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of why we are not really reducing demand in the way we should be. I think partly it might be a failure of imagination to imagine what our society could look like by 2050. And so what are the kinds of changes that might take place, after decades of environmental, demographic, technological change? And I'm a big fan of sci-fi, so when I read sci-fi, I watch sci-fi, and I always think, oh, you've had absolutely no idea, how far we've come, the kind of technologies we've got now. So you've not really imagined. So I imagine that something like that might happen 20, 30 years from now when we look at our scenarios here. So that's what we're trying to do, trying to imagine different futures in our society. And essentially this is about trying to make the policies for net zero more resilient and to stress test some of the assumptions that those policies are making. So the net zero strategy itself assumes that some of the behaviours, or most of the behaviours, will continue as they are now. And although it acknowledges that some behaviours will need to change to adopt low emission technologies, for example, but this aspect is not explored in depth. So this project is trying to fill that gap partly. And we are particularly interested in exploring those changes that are more bottom-up. So they're coming from the society itself without big interventions. So the two questions that we're trying to answer is how society might change, what it might look like by 2050, in terms of mainly non-technological changes. So we know that technology, is looked at in great detail in scenarios that already exist. But what would people do? What would society do? That's slightly different. And in that sense, we're also trying to learn from some of the past transitions that happened before. For example, whether it's a transition to seat belts or a transition to gay marriage, and what that can teach us about something that's going to happen in future in terms of the energy systems. Next slide, please. And so this is an overview of what we've been doing so far. So we've started with large-scale evidence gathering in terms of different factors that are affecting societies, and what are the things that are emerging in the political, economic, social, legal, environmental, and technological areas. So we went really broad. So we looked at changes such as political movements, digital trust, legal cases that are growing in terms of climate change litigation. And we had a really long list of those drivers in different areas, which we then brought to an expert panel and then shortlisted some critical uncertainties, we call them, which have particularly high uncertainty, but also quite likely to have a lot of impact. So, for example, climate change legislation in future. So that was our second part of the project. And then we went away and came up with some narratives for scenarios in future, again using experts' help and civil servants' help to try and see what the future might look like in 2050. And here we draw on two axes of uncertainty. So one is, I think, more or less common in scenarios, which is economic growth or development. So whether our society would be well developed in terms of technologies or not, and whether that would be accepted behaviorally. The other axis is more interesting, so that's the axis of trust. So how much trust there's going to be in society, whether it's trust between groups within society, for example, different generations, older or younger, or different groups within rural or urban populations, or whether it's trust towards government or different organizations. So there's a lot of gradation within that trust axis. And so we've got those qualitative narratives, and now we are translating them into what the energy system might look like for those futures. And so we're working with the CREDS modelling team for that. That's where we're actually translating the qualitative bit into the quantitative modelling insights. And so all of this is still internal, so we've not published anything, but we will publish by the end of the year. And so hopefully that will contribute somewhat to the debate on how energy demand could change, could be reduced. And that sort of sums up the project so far. Okay, next slide, please. That's it. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, brilliant. Thanks very much. Okay, and finally we have Professor Alice Larkin, also here at Manchester Tyndall Centre. Alice and I have worked a little bit together on various aspects of transport. I did fail to introduce myself at the beginning. I'm someone that works on transport. I lead the transport thing with the Newkirk and CREDS. So we have had quite a lot of interaction about aviation over the years, and no doubt we'll continue to do so. Welcome, Alice.
Thanks very much, Jillian. I haven't got any slides, apologies, but just want to give you a few reflections. I'm going to start my timer just to make sure that I don't go over too much. So I was asked the same sort of questions that the others have been asked around the opportunities, and the first thing I just wanted to reiterate, because I just think it's incredibly important, and actually Maria reminded me of how important it is sometimes to repeat things that perhaps have been said many times before, but actually perhaps still don't cut through. And I guess this is why this piece of work I think is really, really important, this emphasis on demand. For me, the opportunity of looking at energy demand reduction is that we will be able to meet our Paris climate objectives, and I just don't think that we can meet them otherwise. So I just think it's absolutely essential. That is our opportunity. It's the opportunity not to have to adapt to very much more severe climate change impacts. So, our budget, our carbon budget is vanishingly small. The importance of not focusing so much on the very long term, we have heard, quite a lot about 2050, but the reality is that it really matters so much what happens now, and that is, a fundamental underpinning to this work. We're using up this fragile carbon budget at about 10% per year, and that's about how much we've got left if you're looking at analysis of 1.5 degrees. So we have to look at demand side, and we have to avoid having impossible rates of reduction in the future, which is what the cumulative emissions framework will tell you. And so very much welcome this report. I just briefly want to talk about aviation, because I think it's a kind of interesting example of where this message comes out very strongly and has done for a long time, but just why that is the case, and then perhaps try to answer the other questions that have been posed. So if you take aviation and aircraft, one of the really big challenges with that is that the technology around the aviation industry lasts for decades. So aircraft, 20, 30 years, the designs, the use and the infrastructure around them are very much locked in. We haven't seen very significant change. I started working on aviation and climate change in 2003 as a postdoc, and was saying some of the similar things. You know, the airframes look very similar now to what they've looked like for decades. And there's very low fleet turnover, which means that if you want to decarbonise a sector like aviation, then it's going to happen really, really slowly, and especially if there isn't sufficient emphasis on what those technological options are. And we've missed an opportunity over the past couple of decades to explore that. So in terms of completely changing the aviation industry, you know, looking at completely different designs and new technologies, that takes decades. And so the debate has kind of got to the point, well, we need to focus on sustainable aviation fuels. That's a drop-in fuel. That's an option that is relatively short term. And the challenges there are around the life cycle of the fuels. We've been hearing about the biomass challenges, the issues of feedstocks. You know, are they really low carbon? Can we actually know that? And then you've got to look at the time frame for the deployment of those if you're going to decarbonise aviation. And of course, when you do start to unpick some of that, and our colleague Asha, who's over there, who's working on aviation and shipping and fuel supply chains, been looking at you know, the time frame for actually, you know, very significant implementation of low carbon fuels for aviation is long. So it then points you towards demand side management. And interestingly, about, I would say, maybe 5 years ago and sort of shortly after, demand side management in aviation actually did start to gain some traction. And was something that you could actually talk about without having eggs thrown at you. And particularly after the citizens' assemblies, or during the citizens' assemblies and the outcomes of those, the ones here and also in Scotland. And then we had COVID, which has also demonstrated that, you know, change can happen, and that, well, that people can operate differently and with different ways of doing things that are lower carbon. And that's absolutely necessary if we're going to offset the opportunity that we don't have on the technology side for aviation. However, all the chatter at the moment is around bouncing back, you know, let's reset, let's get back to what we were pre-COVID. And that's a massive issue for us in climate change and in aviation. So why are we not making more of the opportunity? I think in the UK in particular, the government has refocused on the technological opportunities for aviation. This is very much emphasised in the strategy, net zero strategy. There's a comment about, you know, we need to focus on the commercialisation of UK sustainable aviation fuels so people can fly guilt-free. That's the sort of the message in that document. And there's lots of focus of getting back to normal and, you know, getting back on track with the aviation industry. So really this focus on sustainable aviation fuels and alternatives is really coming out much more strongly now. But it's really important to recognise that aviation and air travel is used predominantly by the rich. It's very disproportionate in terms of its use. Much more, I mean, many aspects of our energy system are in that sense disproportionate, but aviation is particularly skewed. I think in the UK it's something like 75% of the flights are taken by 15% of the population, something along those lines. So, you know, it's actually not everybody that this is an issue for. It's people who are flying a lot and sort of focusing there. I think that talking now with my local hat on, if you like, I'm in a management role, if you like, in the university, and we look at policies to explore low carbon travel and demand side management and so on. And one of the things that becomes clear, and I think it's part of this disproportional issue, is that you tend to get more pushback the more senior somebody is, typically, to you know, in your own organisation, and I'm sure this is the case possibly for many other organisations. So it's a real challenge, you know, having that conversation about let's do things differently, let's build on this COVID opportunity to be able to, you know, use more virtual engagement and so on. You can have that conversation, albeit challenging still, with PGR researchers, with postdoctoral researchers. It gets increasingly difficult the more senior people that I have to have that conversation with. So I guess a sort of blocker and a barrier, is how much of this is tied up with esteem, freedom, prestige. Politics was mentioned by Patrick. Are we talking here, the biggest challenge around aviation, is it about turkeys voting for Christmas? It's the people, it's ourselves who are the ones who are doing all the flying that are the ones that need to bring in the policies to manage our own demands around flying. And I think that, academia is one example, but, this is obviously the case in decision and policy making as well. So very briefly, how can we bridge the gap? Well, one thing is, I think, UKIRC is a great demonstration of interdisciplinary research, which is absolutely needed to really unpick some of the timeframes that we're talking about when we talk about technically feasible. We have to look at the economic issues, the other environmental issues, institutional barriers and so on when we're talking about things like low carbon aviation fuel, sustainable aviation fuel, and look at, how does that timeframe match or not match with the challenge that we've got in terms of those cumulative emissions and that pathway. It's not just about technical feasibility. So we need more interdisciplinarity and more interdisciplinary studies, more of the social sciences. Great to hear about the new ESRC investment. We obviously need to share our findings and discuss with policy makers. It was mentioned earlier about clear messaging, absolutely essential. We need to be really clearly messaging what technologies can and can't do and when. I think the when is really important. And I think we also need to understand where this bounce back is being encouraged and why. So maybe there are very legitimate areas where it should be supported and developed, but not everywhere, surely. And I'm facing this within my own local world, if you like. So who should take action? Well, us academics need to be building the evidence on the timeline. I think the Committee on Climate Change, they emphasise that no airport expansion should be happening unless the industry outperforms its trajectory. So I think we need to be holding the industry to account in terms of its performance on the sustainable aviation fuel issue. And then very locally, I think universities have a role with our own local policies. At the end of the day, I don't think, as Patrick has pointed out, we're going to get these big, heavy-handed demand-side interventions from higher-level government. But, the reality is that a lot of this change happens locally. It happens by, universities deciding on what budget goes towards travel, policies. Can we reshape and disrupt professionally how, what our practices are around academia and how we do things, and just question those things. Set some targets, definitely include long-distance travel in that report, and demonstrate leadership by actually showing that even those people in senior positions can run an academic career without it being very high carbon. So that's it. Thank you.
Can I sit up? Thanks very much, Alice. That's fantastic. That's given us also a really structured way of answering some of the questions that we set out to do. Oh, excellent. I seem to have questions on here, which is fantastic. I've got to get my eye into those. I should have been sitting with those. But anyway, I'll get my eye into those. I'm going to take the liberty of starting my questions first. Do we have Patrick as well? We do. Great. Lovely.
We're blocking in.
Fantastic.
Move up one.
So we've had, in a variety of different ways, we've had from each of the speakers some thoughts about the way in which we can look at the demand side, how some of us have looked at the demand side, and some thoughts on why it isn't happening already. So some of the things I picked up, Patrick gave two very sort of clear reasons. I'm sure he's got more, but he offered two up as to why it isn't happening already. So he said policymakers need big things. It's too complex to tackle all the smaller fragmented aspects of the sort of demand and the different levels of governance that would entail. So that was one of them. The other one he came up with was ideological issues around policy and politics, conservative values and so on. So there were a couple of clear things there. Alice was talking about the sort of techno-optimism, I would say. It was one of the things we were talking about, and this focus on technology, but also perhaps some real lack of engagement or willing to accept the timelines involved. That's certainly a very clear message, I think, that came out of Alice's, obviously in relation to aviation, but we can apply that far more broadly. So what I'm going to do while I get my eye into these questions and order them. I was just going to ask Steve and Maria if you wanted to just also give us sort of very quickly your one or two real kind of, this is why I think it isn't happening, the first things that come to you. So Steve, we'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, I agree with many of the sort of reasons provided. I think there is this issue of complexity, sort of demand side being seen as quite messy, a difficult story to sell and to tell. I mean, there's another sort of, maybe another reason. I mean, one is that, and this is, I think John mentioned this previously, but the idea that the supply side has a stronger voice than the demand side. I mean, there's a lot of sort of lobbying and industrial interests that can push forward the supply side options, whether that be around hydrogen, CCS, nuclear, and so forth. Whereas, you know, the demand side is much more heterogeneous and diverse and in very small pockets. So I think it's harder to sort of push forward that message from the ground up. So maybe that's another one.
Mm-hmm. Good, thanks. Maria?
I think, yes, there's so many good points that have already been made today. I'd like to add to Patrick's point on values and how we pitch that message of how we reduce emissions, because we do emphasize a lot the aspect of maybe damage to the environment and how we can keep it pristine potentially, or we emphasize justice as well, how people are affected. These are also sort of left-wing values, but the values like, you know, national pride or family or faith, I think they should also be emphasized a lot more in terms of their co-benefits for emission reductions. So I think that's something we need to look at in terms of pitching the message to people's values and how those changes. I mean, a lot of people are afraid of change, and things that we are suggesting in terms of demand reductions would be quite disruptive potentially. It's about changing the way we live, so that's quite scary. So I think appealing to those deeper values within people's minds might be a helpful idea.
Great, okay, fantastic. Okay, so in this very democratic way of fielding questions for this kind of session, the most upvoted, who am I to argue? So the most upvoted question pertains to something that Patrick has said. So Patrick, I'll come to you to just add a few thoughts and then to the others here. So the question is, Patrick's observations on the politics are really helpful. How do we work with the political narrative of going with the grain of consumer behaviour on societal change interventions? And I think that is interesting because this going with the grain is, I mean, can we achieve what we're saying we need to achieve by going with the grain? If it's our only chance, how far can we kind of push that grain, if that's the right way of putting it? So, Patrick.
Yeah, I think this is an excellent question and not an easy one to answer at all. I mean, personally, I find this quite difficult because I don't actually have strongly held conservative values, so I don't believe that advocating change is necessarily problematic. And there's a part of me that thinks the best way to do this is to point out to people in positions of authority and say how, despite their conservative values, they are expecting people to go against the grain in lots of different ways in lots of other policy areas and point out the fundamental contradictions potentially in that. But I don't think actually that's going to be very successful either. So I think I'd probably come back to the point which I think Maria just made, which might be a more effective way of communicating from academic scholars to conservative policymakers, which is to mention the synchrony between demand-side interventions and conservative values, and to be really cautious and careful about the narratives we employ. And I'm not sure if Maria is directly picking up on this, but I'm very minded of the paper which was published by Lorraine Whitmarsh, Adam Corner, I think, and colleagues several years ago, which talked about the way in which people who hold different political values responded to different narratives about climate change. And as she mentioned, this idea of, you know, great British energy, etc., or dealing with waste, you know, preventing waste. these were messages that had very strong positive reception in people with conservative values. So I think that research actually gives, and it could be built on, I think, as well, but it gives some useful tips for us in suggesting ways forward which are both commensurate with the current party that's in power and seeks to get the job done in the sense of being potentially open to narratives which can enable the deployment in a widespread basis across society. And I'm pretty sure that the Cardiff work that was done through UKirk several years ago also picked up on some of those key values that were picked up in terms of avoiding waste. So I think there are ways forward we can navigate our ways through this. And I certainly agree that falling back on narratives for action in this area in terms of a justice narrative or an environmental, let's stop environmental disaster, rather than ones that are focusing on local or national pride, community strength, working with the grain in that way, that might be a more suitable way forward.
Thanks, Patrick. And I just want to add my 2 pence worth in on that. I wonder whether coming out of COVID, there is a window of opportunity with respect to values that have something to do with establishing a resilient society, being able to be prepared, being able to sort of more equity across, who gets impacted. Maybe there are some values there which we haven't quite understood that are at the moment perhaps at the fore and worth investigating because we've come out of a crisis. But would others like to sort of comment on this going with the grain idea?
I suppose what it's making me think about, so this is like not a fully formed thoughts, is that we still seem to be talking about the fact that this message needs to reach everybody, which I don't think it's the case, given that how skewed the contribution is. I mean, this on a global scale, but also within countries. So I think it would be interesting to kind of overlay, the sort of where the big hits are in terms of different socioeconomic groups across societies, with then a thinking about, okay, well, what are the different values and the different ways of actually talking and communicating with people, but really thinking about focusing attention on the people where if we reduce those emissions, that will have a bigger impact, because some people's emissions are really low. So it isn't an everybody issue. I mean, like it's more people in the UK than it is, for example, in India. But we are talking about very, disparity within countries as well as between countries. So I just think that from a UK perspective, maybe if we did some of that overlay in the values, I think that would be really interesting, actually.
It would be really interesting. But what scares me is when, as you were talking about with a specific issue, if the more senior you go up through the organisation, the more resistant you get. The more senior you go up through an organisation, the more wealth they have, the more likely they are to be the ones that are in the high emitter class and therefore more resistant. And so that overlay may look actually really, really scary.
It might be scary, but maybe we should look at it, really actually analyse it, because we're not getting very far with it at the moment, even with people who say that they buy into the agenda, but, that policy is just not going to go down well. And it's like, how do we get past that?
Any further comments on that, on the going with grant? I mean, is there anything that comes out of the discussions in the scenarios about because you were talking about there being or the attempt in the exercise to think about these societal shifts that are going to take place. Society does change, behaviour changes all the time. So the grain actually is for change. That does. That is what going with the grain could also mean. Is that sort of something that's come out of the scenario, sort of more optimism about momentum?
So part of the work we're doing is trying to see what previous transitions happened, and they happened maybe not because of something that government did, but because the society wanted it. And so we are trying to look at some of that evidence, not necessarily in the energy sector, but in other sectors, whether it's the smoking issue or the gay marriage, like I mentioned, which was more bottom up, and then that persuaded the government later to change its opinion on the issue. And so we're hoping to learn some of that from the transitions literature. Another thing I was going to comment on is on the perhaps irrationality of people, of us, because we're not rational beings. Obviously, we often don't do things that would benefit us or things that would work in our own best interests. I guess, and that we have to square with giving autonomy to people and the freedom of choice, which we all love, obviously. So that's a difficult message as well. So, you know, when we think in those terms, I guess we're a bit like babies, and babies scream and rage when you take away a knife or scissors, even though they may well hurt themselves if you do not.
That's a good image. Yeah, we're all like little babies. Yeah.
So, no offence to anyone here, but there are things that we need to perhaps be guided, and some of this could be done through changing infrastructures around us, like the flow of people in the tube. You know, it's all directed, isn't it? Like so that it's easy to choose. So some of those things might need to be thought through from both perspectives, as irrational beings and as free choosing beings.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just wanted to pick up on, I think Patrick mentioned the idea of choice architecture and actually getting that right so that people are able to make a choice, you know, that may be low carbon, but that, for me, seems to need a huge amount of sort of public policy to go into place. I mean, I'm thinking about the sort of example of active travel and actually getting infrastructure in place that enables people to, you know, ride safely to work and back home again. So I think it's too much to. There needs to be huge investment and serious policy from government in terms of allowing those choices to be made and maybe changing the grain a little bit.
All within the context of choice.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we could have a whole, maybe should have a whole session on choice and really whether you can take choice away at the same time. You know, you can give the illusion of more choice whilst actually taking certain bad things away. But anyway, I won't hog the space on that because I've got lots of thoughts on that. So we'll go to another question instead. And this I think is interesting, which is about societal innovations. So I think. So the question is, what kinds of societal innovation would enable dramatic levels of social change? They're likely politically infeasible from straightforward service demand reduction. So, I mean, I take this, I think this is interesting because I think there's a lot of innovation to be had in terms of the provision of services and how we provide services and what services we provide. And I think the idea that there's innovation, there's money to be made, there are value chains in these developments, I think often gets lost because we think of innovation as being around the technology. So, yeah, what sort of thing comes to mind for you around innovation, societal innovation?
Shall I randomly start waffling? Okay. What I was just thinking about then is there's innovation, but then what we need is innovation that still doesn't have an unintended consequence of increasing emissions. And I think that you know, one of the sort of the issues around innovation is what you want is as much freedom as possible for innovation to happen. So you just kind of want to, you know, support it and then and see it flourish. But if you do that, then it won't necessarily go in the direction that we need it to go in terms of the demand side. So I suppose I was just thinking about, you know, I feel like university education is actually in a big transition at the moment. And if you think about innovation in terms of some of the technologies that we've used in order to kind of teach the students and to do our research and interact with each other, you know, there has been innovation there, but there is a real strong push now to kind of pull back and roll back because it's like, oh, you know, we're not giving the right student experience and so on. And it makes me think, well, you know, school children now who are going to be coming into our system are interacting, communicating and engaging in a way that feels quite unfamiliar. And we just think, oh, well, it's all right, we'll just put it all back again and it'll be fine. So it just makes me think we need to look for where innovation is actually already happening, perhaps in much younger audiences and with kids, and how are they doing things differently, and what can we learn from that in relation to how do we then manage that in such a way that, you know, because the youth movement is incredibly engaged on climate change. So if one of the kind of constraints on that innovation is low energy consumption and low emissions, but doing the things that you need to do. I think that perhaps we are too constrained with the way in which we have been doing things. I think it almost makes it too difficult for us to see what that innovation is. So I think we just need to reach out to people who are not just thinking about climate change, just thinking about education and transfer of information and knowledge and how we're living our lives post-COVID, because I think it's been a massive, shock.
Yeah. That's. As much as I appreciate the challenge in what you're saying, it's actually a very positive way of looking at it, I would say. Any other comments on that? Patrick, just so that you know, I can see you if you wave at me, so but jump in if you've got any thoughts. No? All right, okay. So we'll go to a question that I think does really come to the heart of this, and there are some insights from the modelling, but other thoughts, which is about the degree to which the reluctance on government to support some of the things we've been talking about is to do with the perception that it will have a negative impact on the economy. So the relationship between the sorts of things we're talking about and economic growth. It's related to the last question, of course, but specifically in relation to the economic implications.
Well, I can make a start. So in terms of the reluctance of this government and other governments as well, I think before we criticise someone, we should walk a mile in their shoes, and that way, when we criticise them, we are a mile away and we've got their shoes. So that's a start. But more seriously, I think the government, if we look at its activities, it could be imagined as, as a conductor of a symphony. So a conductor knows, they have an overview of the entire symphony, but they also have to perform all these different passages within the symphony. And so we academics and other researchers have the luxury of focusing on those little passages and going really deep into our areas of expertise and then advising from that perspective. But I think if we want the government to adopt those changes we're suggesting, we also need to have the overview of that symphony, so that we know actually the perspective that the government looks at the entire economy. So I think that's something that, I've been trying to adopt that, but I think it's quite a different mindset to us academics to think about in terms of overcoming that resistance within the policy circles.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Steve, we costed, didn't we, in terms of our work, the cost savings because of the smaller energy system that would be required. So that's one aspect of part of the answer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think just thinking back again to Mike Thompson's graph, certainly the scenarios we were developing would show a very large benefit, but then I think maybe there's a question which came up in the course of the project. Well, you're taking a lot of investment away in various sectors of the economy by reducing the size of your system, which is a sort of quite an interesting way to look at it. But I think there's, from my perspective, there hasn't been a serious assessment of actually whether these measures would lead to changes in economic growth. I think there are a lot of areas where you can see huge economic opportunities, whether that be sort of investing in active travel infrastructure or in terms of energy efficiency retrofit. There's a huge number of opportunities. Heat pumps is another one. So I think what we're trying to do, and I think John has been speaking to different economic modelers about actually running these scenarios through and actually seeing, what are the implications? And I think that would be a really important exercise, and one that I think would be helpful in the kind of policy discussions with government.
But do you think we have enough evidence around the costs, the monetary costs, either of implementing some of the things that we want to, but the implications? Costing the health benefits, for instance.
Sure.
How are we actually going to get the evidence around that?
It's a really good question. One thing that we haven't done. So what we didn't do was probably incorporate all of the costs of all of the demand side reduction measures in our modelling, but at the same time we didn't incorporate the benefits from, you know, the co-benefits to health, air quality and so forth. So I think there's probably a need to do a more sort of comprehensive full costing analysis, as well as looking at the macroeconomic impacts and crucially also the distributional impacts, which is a really another really important part of this story, which could see, you know, maybe does have a sort of levelling up component in some aspects and not in others, but there's a lot of work to be done there, I think. Yeah.
Can I take the liberty of jumping in here just to follow on from that? Something that I've been trying to formulate in my mind, which is here we have, and obviously I'm keen and I'm a fan on lots of different scenario exercises, and we come out with these scenarios. But sometimes I just feel tempted to suggest that there are only two scenarios, which is success or failure when it comes to thinking about the climate, right? And with respect to demand, we're up against this resistance. I mean, there are some other follow-on questions here about, you know, resistance to change, and, you know, people want their creature comforts and so on. The problem is that we think about change in relation to what we have today and our nice, cosy and relatively affordable, although getting a bit more expensive lifestyles today, right? But if we don't succeed with respect to reaching our climate targets, then things are going to change. Things are going to become more expensive anyway. Behaviour will be forced to change. Choice will be constrained anyway. How can we actually communicate that the future baseline that we are comparing our current lifestyles against is also one of the scenarios, and that scenario looks worse in terms of the choice architecture that will be around than the ones that we're trying to suggest will be a positive future? I mean, how do we get that across and actually, you know, talk about the fact that there really are broadly only two scenarios?
I mean, you just made me think about something we discussed a long time ago about in the Tyndall Centre. You know, it's mitigate for 2, adapt for 4 was the strap line. So in other words, you know, you articulate and discuss at length the impacts at a much higher temperature, you know, climate outcomes, because there is a huge amount of uncertainty, and in terms of what we've actually observed, things are happening much sooner than anticipated. But you know, you need to be articulating that in the same meetings and discussions as you're articulating what does the future look like when we've, you know, got very significant reductions in energy demand in the areas that we need it, and, you know, changes to the supply side and so on. And I think that we continue to separate these discussions. You know, we have the mitigation conversation, and then we have the adaptation and impacts conversation. And, you know, I know that there are places where those happen together, but perhaps they're just not, perhaps they should always be together. You know, maybe that should just be the rule, because otherwise we're not laying out what the reality is. We're just disconnecting from the fact that we're on a trajectory where it's getting warmer, and there are going to be impacts that again are going to hit disproportionately across society.
Patrick, do you want to comment on that? Just because obviously within the IPCC it's separate as well, isn't it? The adaptation and mitigation elements.
I agree, and even I was just going to bring us back down to the local level a bit more. I've been involved for the last 3 or 4 years in the Devine climate emergency process. I chair a net zero task force there, and we ran a citizens assembly last year. And it's again, you fall into the same old fault lines of having lots and lots of effort on the mitigation side and hardly any on the adaptation, and it would be structurally very difficult to combine those different areas of work. So I completely agree. It's easier to say than to do, but I completely agree that we need more joined up, integrated perspectives and activity in these areas. I was trying to say that in my slides as well, about not saying that we need kind of technological change on one side and kind of behavioural change on the other. We actually need them all if we're going to mobilise effectively. So we need integrated perspectives and integrated solutions, or I don't think it's going to work. And that the example around climate mitigation, climate adaptation is a really good one to put there. I think the only other thing I'd be tempted to add is that in our discussions at the local level, we've got a huge issue around building retrofit and making that stack up from a business model point of view and rolling it out at scale fast. There are enormous issues in rural areas that I think are often not picked up sufficiently about fuel poverty, people who are reliant upon oil or gas for heating because they're off the gas grid. And I guess the socio-technical challenges in making rapid headway at scale in changing that in terms of building heat, for example, just to take one example, are formidable. But I also think there's enormous opportunity to reskill people across society, to kind of deploy at scale a kind of an infrastructural change process which tackles that issue that's been outstanding for a long time about just poorly constructed buildings, poorly insulated buildings, people living in fuel poverty. I mean, these are issues that have been known about for such a long time, but I think the urgency with which we need to tackle them at scale provides to me an enormous economic opportunity to mobilise lots of SMEs, lots of organisations and businesses to take advantage of this and to deploy that rapidly. So I'd just like to see more positivity around that economic benefit if we can get that mobilised. But I mean, I'm not an economist, so need more expertise, I think, on that side, but it does seem to me like an enormous opportunity at local and regional levels, which can pick up on the levelling up point that was made already.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we've all got some real thinking to do on the research agenda around this, and it's very urgent, as is everything, obviously. That has brought us to time. So thank you very much. This has been an odd one for me. I find I have no idea whether these questions have really come from any of you in the room, or they've just, and so I don't actually know kind of, how you are, and so on, which feels a bit odd. But anyway, you've got the options to talk to us in the coffee break next and shout any thoughts that you haven't been able to articulate. And we'll welcome those, obviously. But thanks very much to everyone, and double thank you to Steve, who stepped in at the last minute. I was going to be on the panel waffling away anyway. I just stood up here and did it this way instead. So thanks very much, everyone.